This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 301 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Week 7 was a week to forget for a lot of us, so I'll spare you an introduction for today's show, because I'm sure a lot of you listening to this are tilting hard enough about some of the insane things that went down on Sunday. We'll just get right into things. Before looking at this week's transactions, though, the NBA is back. I'm not telling you to go become a big NBA fan because you're tilting so hard at the NFL, but I am telling you to check out FanDuel's $1 million NBA clutch shot contest that's happening tonight. Take your pick of Pelicans, Raptors, Lakers, and Clippers stars and compete for your share of the $1 million prize pool, including a $250,000 first place prize, all for just $4. All you have to do is fill out a 9-man roster, turn on the game, and follow along using FanDuel's incredible live scoring feature. It's that easy. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Buy Leonard Fournette. As I talk about every single week and almost every single episode of this show, yards correlate strongly to touchdowns. The more yards a player has, the more touchdowns he generally scores. And we can use that information when spotting regression. When a player has a whole lot of yards, but he hasn't found the end zone a lot, generally speaking, he's probably going to positively regress. And that's where Leonard Fournette is at right now. Only 3 players in the NFL have 900 or more yards from scrimmage this year. Christian McCaffrey is one of them, Dalvin Cook is one of them, and the third one is Leonard Fournette. But the reason that Leonard Fournette isn't in their tier in fantasy is because he hasn't found the end zone. McCaffrey has 9 touchdowns this year, Dalvin Cook has 8, Leonard Fournette has 1. Now, this isn't me trying to say that Leonard Fournette should have just as many touchdowns as Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook. They're in better situations. But he should also have more than 1 touchdown. Based on his rushing and receiving yardage totals, and this is through taking averages from the last 5 years of running back data, but using his yardage totals, he should have roughly 5 more touchdowns than he currently has. Even if you cut that by 60%, you're looking at 18 more fantasy points across the season. That would give him over 20 PPR points per game. That would be elite production for Leonard Fournette. He has over 91% of Jacksonville's running back rushes. He has a 17% target share. You should want Leonard Fournette on your fantasy football team. Sell Aaron Jones. Now, on the opposite side of the yards to touchdowns conversion is Aaron Jones. He now has 9 touchdowns this year, but his rushing and receiving yards tell us that number should be closer to 4. That's the largest gap of has versus should have touchdowns in the NFL. And yes, context is always needed with this type of analysis. Don't think that I'm looking at this stuff blindly. Aaron Jones has seen the second most goal line attempts in the NFL this year, and he's in a pretty good offense. So scoring opportunities are going to be better in somewhere like Green Bay than in Jacksonville. But of the 9 goal line rushes that Aaron Jones has, he saw 6 of the 9, nice, in 2 games without Jamal Williams. The first was against Philadelphia, where Williams was concussed at the beginning of the contest, and the second was against Dallas, where Aaron Jones had a career day. And unsurprisingly, in those 2 games without Jamal Williams, Aaron Jones saw his highest snap share of the season. When Jamal Williams has been active this year, Jones hasn't hit a 60% snap share. With Jamal Williams, Aaron Jones has seen about 60% of Green Bay's running back touches. Without him, it's 82%. So all this being said, with Jamal Williams active and in the lineup, we shouldn't expect Aaron Jones to continue to keep up this pace. We can't expect Aaron Jones to be a top 5 running back from here on out. Even though I love him as a talent, even though I think he's the best running back in that Green Bay backfield, I think you can sell him. Buy Kenny Golladay. So entering week 7, Babytron was one of the few NFL wide receivers with at least a 20% target share in every single game that they played this season. So of course, because week 7 was so wild, he had a 4% target share against Minnesota. And I'm using this transaction to simply say that this stuff happens. And it makes a lot of sense to bank on the multi-game sample of Kenny Golladay seeing a lot of work in this Lions offense versus one game where his quarterback may have liked a particular matchup. And with the Giants and Raiders upcoming on the Lions schedule, Babytron should be able to bounce back right away. Add Ty Johnson. So at the time of this recording, we don't know what's going on with Kerryon Johnson and his knee. What we do know is that he was injured in Sunday's game and Ty Johnson took over that Lions backfield. Ty Johnson should be added off the waiver wire no matter what. The severity of Kerryon Johnson's injury will tell you how much FOB you should actually spend on him. Buy Tyler Boyd. So like I said in my 15 transactions column this week, the Bengals offense is hot trash. But as a result, you shouldn't be paying a lot to acquire Tyler Boyd. But I do think that there's enough positives surrounding him right now to at least warrant some sort of buy low transaction. He currently ranks in the top 10 in wide receiver target share. He's seen at least 16% of Cincinnati's targets in every single game this year. Boyd's actually had a 22% share or better in all but 2 games. And we should always buy volume in fantasy football. It's what correlates to production. The targets that are going Boyd's way aren't as valuable as someone getting targets from someone like Aaron Rodgers. Of course. But that doesn't mean that we just push aside his volume and we ignore it, especially when he's been underperforming recently. Over his last 2 games, he's caught just 8 of 21 targets. But over a larger sample, which is the first 5 games of the season, that catch rate was a lot better. We shouldn't let recency bias overshadow what Tyler Boyd is. And if you're worried about Boyd's potential if and when AJ Green returns, don't be worried, because Boyd's actually averaged more points with AJ Green historically than without him. To me, it's just always about buying volume, even when it's bad volume or mediocre volume. Because generally speaking, when it's bad volume or volume for a player in a bad offense, that poor situation is reflected in the price that you have to pay to acquire that player. In other words, everyone knows that Tyler Boyd is playing in a bad offense. That makes it easier to acquire him. Sell Corey Davis. Look, I like Corey Davis and I think that he's a good wide receiver. The problem is I don't like his situation at all. Yes, he did have a 25% target share on Sunday against the Chargers, and he did perform. And it was the first game with Ryan Tannehill, so maybe there's something between Ryan Tannehill and Corey Davis. But this is still a run-first offense. We know what they want to do offensively. They're not going to want to put the ball in Ryan Tannehill's hands week in and week out. And there's a lot of competition on top of that. You have A.J. Brown, you have Adam Humphries out of the slot, you have capable pass-catching tight ends. You know, despite the fact that he had a 25% target share, he still only saw 7 targets on Sunday. It's because they have a run-heavy offense. Maybe you're buying into this Tannehill narrative. I can understand it. It makes some sense. And maybe you're buying into the fact that this week they get Tampa Bay. That's a plus matchup for Corey Davis. To me, though, I would use those 2 things to try to sell Davis this week, because chances are we're not going to see week in and week out consistency from a really good wide receiver. Add Kenny Stills. So it sounds like Will Fuller is going to be sidelined for some time with a hamstring pull. So that means Kenny Stills gets a big bump. He ended up playing about 94% of Houston's snaps on Sunday, which is the second most at wide receiver behind DeAndre Hopkins, and he had a 15% target share. He has a 13.2 average depth of target this year. That's about a yard shy of Will Fuller's. For all intents and purposes, he's going to take Will Fuller's job. He's taking that role in the offense. So Kenny Stills should be a priority add this week, and I don't mind Kiki QT either. Buy Alvin Kamara. So according to ProFootballDoc.com, Alvin Kamara has a reasonable chance to play in Week 8. And then all the while, Drew Brees intends to practice this week. Maybe they both play in Week 8. Maybe they don't. Either way, I still think this is a good time to buy Kamara. And honestly, if Kamara doesn't go in Week 8, you can probably get him for even cheaper because he has a bye in Week 9. But we know that he's an elite asset in fantasy football. And with Teddy Bridgewater under center, his numbers have suffered. In 4 or 5 games played with Teddy Bridgewater this year, Kamara's failed to score 17 PPR fantasy points. He averaged 19.6 and 23.6 points per game over his last 2 seasons. And I think that he can get back to those levels when Drew Brees returns. The Saints and Teddy Bridgewater have been winning. That's great. Sean Payton's doing an awesome job. But it's not like the offense is the sole reason for that. Since Week 3, which is when Teddy Bridgewater officially took over, they're 14th in yards per drive and they're 15th in touchdown rate per drive. They've been a fairly average offense. Now that's good considering what they're working with, but it's not Drew Brees good. We know their ceiling with Drew Brees. We know they can be a top 5 offense. And with a better offense comes more scoring opportunities. Kamara's found the end zone in just 1 game this year. He scored twice against Seattle. And according to his rushing and receiving yardage totals, he should have about 2 more touchdowns than he currently has. That makes him one of the bigger positive regression candidates in fantasy football. And historically, Kamara has outpaced his expected touchdown total because the Saints' offense has typically been good. So moving forward, it would be wise to consider Kamara as a locked-in RB1 in fantasy football, a higher-end RB1, because this injury doesn't sound severe. So if you can get him for cheap because of the injury and because of the bye week, I think you do it. Sell Todd Gurley. Yes, I know the Rams are playing the Bengals this week. That's one of the best matchups, if not the best matchup on paper. So if you want to wait to get rid of Todd Gurley, be my guest. It's hard to fault that logic. But I tend to play things more conservatively and not bank on matchups, especially when there's a clear sell high opportunity, and that's what you've got with Todd Gurley. Gurley's now finished as a top 15 running back in each of his last 3 games played. But over these 3 games, he's found the end zone 5 times, and he's only had 108 rushing yards and 73 receiving yards. Guys, he's averaged 60.3 total yards per game when the Rams have scored 40, 29, and 37 points over this 3-game stretch. Now, historically, over the last 5 years of running back data, a running back with 311 rushing yards and 81 receiving yards, they've scored roughly 2.5 touchdowns. Gurley has those totals this year, and he has 6 touchdowns. And we've also watched Todd Gurley fail to reach a 60% running back rush share in half of his games played this year. When he was healthy last year, he was handling 84.5% of LA's running back rushes. And on Sunday, he played a season-low 60.5% of the Rams' snaps. You might say it was because the Rams were far ahead, but that's also the point. If the Rams are far ahead, Todd Gurley isn't used as much. That still hurts his fantasy total. It's smart for the Rams to do that, but it's not good for your fantasy team. All of this is to say that Todd Gurley's been a touchdown-dependent fantasy asset. And that's not something that I can confidently bank on week in and week out. Add Mark Walton. So the Dolphins started using Mark Walton a little bit more before their bye week. He saw 35.3% of the team's running back carries back then. And then out of the bye, in week 6, he had a similar share of 31.6%. And then he had a solid 14.3% target share in that game. But then Sunday happened. Walton ended the day with a 60.9% running back rush share, which was easily the highest mark of the season, and he had the highest snap share of any Miami running back. Now, Walton's probably not going to be a plug-and-play running back this year, given the offense that he's in. But the running back position is not a very good position. It's tough to find depth. And with bye weeks here, you might be able to use Mark Walton at some point. Buy Tevin Coleman. So that game against Washington and San Francisco this week didn't bring a lot of production for the players, but we got to see some peripherals. Specifically, we got to see how that 49ers backfield would be split. It's another data point to work with. Now, Matt Breida did miss a little bit of time in that game because he was being evaluated for a concussion. But even still, Tevin Coleman finished the day seeing over 60% of the 49ers running back rushes and over 10% of the team's targets. That rush share was a season high, and the target share was the most that he's seen since week 1. So Coleman's been back for 3 weeks now. He's not only led the 49ers in rush attempts with at least 16 per game, he's also been the team's primary goal line rusher. Now, San Francisco's schedule does get a little bit tougher going forward, so they may not be as run-heavy as they've been, but the peripherals are there for Coleman to be an RB2 from here on out, especially if the 49ers keep winning. Add Dallas Goedert. Week 7 was a tough one to forecast. But at least Dallas Goedert, someone that I mentioned a lot on last week's shows, at least Dallas Goedert was a thing. He ended up scoring a touchdown on a very nice 69 yards, and it was the 4th straight contest where he was able to hit a 10% target share. Remember last week's 10 Trends show where I talked about this? Over the last 4 weeks where he's been healthy, Goedert ranks in the top 25 in routes run at the tight end position according to Pro Football Focus. And he's played at least 59% of the team's snaps in every single game. Prior to week 4, his highest snap share was 51%. Basically, the way that I feel about Goddard is the same that I felt last week. He's probably going to give you similar production as other tight end streamers would. But the upside is there if something were to happen to Zach Ertz. All of a sudden, Dallas Goedert would be a fringe top 5 tight end. Add Ryan Tannehill. So I don't think that you should be thrilled to use Ryan Tannehill this week as a streamer, but he's not an awful option. He's facing the Buccaneers, and the Titans are 2.5-point home favorites, and there's a 46.5-point over-under according to FanDuel Sportsbook. Tampa Bay's allowed a multi-touchdown performance in each of their last 4 games played, and they've gone up against Daniel Jones, Jared Goff, Teddy Bridgewater, and Kyle Allen. They rank 11th in yards per attempt allowed, despite going against those really mediocre passers this year, and they haven't really been able to get to the quarterback. They have the 9th worst sack rate in football. So with Tannehill looking competent in Week 7, I think he can give you some production in Week 8. Buy Robbie Anderson. So the Jets' offense just looked awful Monday night against New England, but it was against the Patriots. They have the best defense in football. Robbie Anderson got the Stephon Gilmore treatment, and as a result, he wasn't very productive. But that happens against New England, and it should change through the rest of the season because New York, over their next 7 games, they get a Jalen Ramsey-less Jacksonville team in Week 8, then they get Miami, New York, Washington, Oakland, Cincinnati, and then Miami again. That's over their next 7 games. 5 of those 7 matchups are against teams that currently rank in the bottom 10 in wide receiver fantasy points against, while the other 2, Jacksonville and Cincinnati, those are still beatable defenses. And don't forget, I talked about this on the 10 Trends show last week, but before this New England game on Monday night, Anderson had been pretty good with Sam Darnold over his last 6 games. He had averaged 9 targets, 5.2 receptions, 80.7 receiving yards, and 0.7 touchdowns per game over that stretch. So don't let a down game against a really good New England defense change the way that you view Robbie Anderson. He's a great buy right now. Add the Detroit Lions defense. There are a few directions that you can go on the waiver wire this week, but Detroit is probably my favorite. They'll be playing at home as 7-point favorites according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and they're facing Danny Dimes. And Daniel Jones' last 4 starts, so all of his starts since his breakout game against Tampa Bay. He's thrown more interceptions during these starts than touchdowns. He has a 4-7 touchdown to interception ratio, and he's been sacked 13 times. Defenses in general, so this includes the Tampa Bay game, they're averaging 3.6 sacks per game against Daniel Jones. That gives them a nice floor each week, and that makes the Lions a nice play as heavy favorites. Okay, for this week's 16th transaction that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com, I'm going to go a little galaxy brain here. I'm going to say to buy Melvin Gordon. Now, if you ask me, I think Austin Eckler is playing better than Melvin Gordon right now. I think 99% of people listening to this would agree. And every single metric tells us the same thing. But Gordon has seen 80%, 62%, and 76% of the Chargers running back rushes in his 3 games played this year. And he's hit an 8% target share in each of those contests as well. And he's also seeing goal line work. And that's with the Chargers easing him back into things, or at least that's what we've been told. And look at the market right now for Melvin Gordon. Go log on to Twitter and see everyone, including myself, hating on the guy, saying that the Chargers would be better off without Melvin Gordon. Even though that kind of talk doesn't directly relate to fantasy football and how a player scores, it can change a player's market value. It changes perception. If people are down on a player in general, he's going to be easier to acquire in fantasy football. But the good news is he's seeing work in that backfield. And Russell Okung is probably back this week. So if there's going to be a time to buy Melvin Gordon low, if Melvin Gordon is going to rebound at all and be a usable fantasy asset, now is the time to buy him. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends show. Thanks for listening, everyone.